Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. We are the Ops Desk. I am Paul Morrow, and today we are excited. We have a really special guest, Randolph Rice of Rice Law, coming to us from Maryland. Mr. Rice representing the family of Rachel Morin. Rachel, allegedly murdered by a Salvadoran illegal immigrant in Maryland, since apprehended, and he is going to take us through the details of that case, which looks like it's going to go to trial. Going to be a big deal. So, Randolph, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, we appreciate you being here. We know how busy you are, and this case is starting to really heat up. So, for our audience, can you just give me the basics? Give us the timeline just in how this poor woman was found and what the subsequent events were.
Sure. So from what we knew early on, in August of 2023, Rachel Morin, who was a mother of five, had gone out for a jog on a Saturday afternoon around 5 o'clock on a very quaint trail in Harford County, Maryland. Now, keep in mind, Harford County is a very rural area. It's a very small community, probably only 6 or 7 homicides a year there, and typically domestic violence related. So she'd gone out, she typically went on a run on the weekends, and she didn't show up that night back at her house. And her boyfriend thought it was sort of odd. Her adult daughter was kind of wondering, this didn't make sense. They ultimately contacted the sheriff's department, and that's when they started the search for Rachel, which thank God they did, because the next day they found her body, unfortunately, in a drainage ditch off of this trail in Harford County.
So I remember the event, and I remember when this happened. At first, she was missing, and they mobilized a lot of resources to try to find her. She went out for this jog, and she seems to have just disappeared. Was her body concealed in any way? Was there any indication that the perpetrator tried to hide Rachel Morin?
Well, early on, we really didn't know much, and that was smart on the part of the Harford County Sheriff's Department, the lead agency. So we knew that her body was dragged off the trail, but we really didn't know that much about what was going on. And the first sort of lead that came up in the public's eye was the DNA hit. They got a hit on a DNA match for a crime that happened in Los Angeles just a few months earlier in March of 2023. And that led them back to Los Angeles and an investigation there.
Did that actually come, the DNA hit, did that actually come through the FBI database?
Yeah, so what they did was they put that into CODIS, which is that database that you're talking about, Paul.
Right.
And ultimately it said, hey, look, we have something back in California from another crime with the same DNA, but they didn't have a name in California either, but they had another piece of evidence which was really helpful early on in the investigation.
So it's just, just to take a step back, it shows you how important the biometrics are and can be, especially if you collect them were they to have been collected in this instance at the border, right? Because as we've all been talking about the border and the lack of security at the border, one of the things that has not been in play is the requirement that as you come in, we're going to take your DNA, we're going to take a swab, we're going to do the biometrics so that if we end up having to find you, we know where you are. And in this case, we had a DNA hit. That alone is rare. And kudos to the two agencies involved here. The two agencies, both in California and down in Maryland, the Sheriff's Department, they did their due diligence. They took the DNA, they put it through CODIS, which is the National Federal Database. And, that thing is starting to get populated enough that you're starting to get some hits where, as in the past, it was really a needle in a haystack, but we didn't have an ID because the perp himself had never been swabbed in any way upon entering the country.
Right, and you mentioned that, and that's something that we'll obviously hit on a little bit later in the story, but that U.S. Fingerprint Act, which was supposed to be being performed by everybody that came to the border, was not being done, and that'll play into a little bit of this story as we go on. So in addition to the California DNA hit, that takes them back to a house in California where a suspect is alleged to have broken into a home and sexually assaulted a minor and possibly some other individuals in the house. But LAPD was being very, very cautious about releasing information, and maybe cautious is the wrong word. They might have been just being stonewalling anybody that went out there and tried to ask about what happened, because I think they didn't do as good of a job of investigating as they probably could have. But what also came from that crime scene in California was a doorbell ring camera video. Now, that camera video was not the best because it only had a side picture of the suspect. So you had the individual leaving the home. There was a lot of questions about this. He was not wearing a shirt. There was no identifying tattoos. They could identify him as a Hispanic male, but that was about it. They saw him leave the home. It maybe lasts 5 seconds. He runs out the front door, and then he's gone. And so we had DNA, and we had a somewhat of a partial video. Didn't give us a full front of the suspect, but we had two really good pieces of evidence that, Paul, typically you don't have in a case like this.
So you have these two disparate cases essentially. You have one on one side of the country, the other's on the other side of the country. You have two agencies involved. LAPD maybe doesn't love the way it was handled at the ground level, but they did have the DNA. They got this ring camera. I recall the ring camera footage being put out nationally. I assume that your firm had a lot to do with that because I know you guys were very proactive. But I remember seeing the ring camera. I remember thinking, okay, husky guy, no shirt. God, this could be anybody because you didn't get a face shot. But I'm wondering, and I got to ask you a very pointed question: was there any sense, and this is just a judgment call opinion, any sense that LA is maybe not quite as aggressive or cooperative as they might have been because they suspected that it was an illegal migrant?
I don't know that necessarily we felt that it was because, well, we didn't know at that point in time. We knew it was an Hispanic male. There was some rumblings internally. We were talking about could this have been somebody that had crossed the border? But LA, I think, to be honest, Paul, more and more I learned about this neighborhood of where this happened. I thought to myself, this might be just the fact that this is such a rough and dangerous neighborhood that they didn't really do a very thorough investigation like they were doing in Harford County here in Maryland, where we had the Harford County Sheriff's Department, we had Maryland State Police, we had the FBI. It sounded like something where an officer maybe came out, collected some evidence, talked to a few people, and that was about it.
Just kind of check the boxes. This is a very high crime area.
Correct.
And they're thinking, a lot of times these sorts of things are unfortunately they're domestics. It's the brother of an ex-boyfriend or something like that, and so they might have been waiting for the next shoe to drop, so to speak, and maybe they weren't getting a lot of pressure to solve it.
Right. And they weren't releasing the location of the home. And Paul, it was funny because we would have a lot of reporters call us and say, "Hey, listen, we're in the neighborhood," and we knew the location of the home because we had done a. If you look at the video, there's a very unique ridge line across the street, and we had actually gone through that police district. We knew the police district, so we went through that police district and went through Google Maps and ultimately found the home. And when
Hmm.
reporters would call us up and say, "Hey, can you give us the address?" Because the Harford County Sheriff's Office said, "Do not release the address of this house. We don't want people going by there."
Right.
Even the reporters said, "Listen, we're in the neighborhood. People here are telling us we need to get out of here because it is that dangerous and it's the middle of the day." So it was that kind of neighborhood that this crime happened in California.
So there's some unique challenges here. You have a crime scene in LA that wasn't wonderfully processed, and it's a very dangerous area. Maybe you're not going to get a ton of cooperation from the locals. You have a case all the way back home here in Maryland, and you got the DNA hit, and realistically, all you have at that point is a commonality. All right. You have an unidentified, you know that there's one guy out there who did both, and you have a partial video, and that's where we terminate up to a certain point. How do we get beyond that?
Well, that's the problem is that when the family came in to see us, oh gosh, a week after this murder, they said, we've got I think the DNA maybe had just been released and the photo was coming soon. And we thought, gosh, this will be over with in no time because we have all this information. But it started to drag a little bit and started to get quiet. And I think, honestly, the Harford County Sheriff's Office was smart and wise in not putting a lot of information out there. But the family wanted to see more action. So we started our firm, we started putting together different campaigns. We first started off with going door to door, and we actually got a Spanish speaking individual to come with us in Harford County and go to the different areas around the head of the trail to talk to the different people there and say, "Hey, listen, do you recognize this picture?" Because we took stills from the doorbell camera. Do you recognize this individual? Does this ring a bell? Does anything, sort of jog your memory here? And we really didn't get anything there because we thought, oh, maybe there'd be some leads, but nothing really panned out in that situation.
So I saw that you guys did a lot of proactive work. When I say you guys, I mean Rice Law. All right, you guys catch the case as the lawyers for the family, enormously sympathetic. It's on the news. Fox News covered it a lot, and it was very much seen as part of the problems that we were inheriting from the porous border. And now, a lot, to be honest, it kind of faded from public consciousness. And, that's no, that's not to throw any shade on the case or how anybody handled it, but just everybody's busy. There was all of a sudden you had Trende Aragua popping, you had the
Right.
Lake and Riley case, you had Jocelyn Ungary, and it really became one of a series of cases that I think Americans were quite concerned about. And then out of the blue, at least from my perspective, all of a sudden I hear, and I was aware of the case and I'm following it, was
Right.
on the air a lot, talking about these kind of cases. I used to name check Rachel Morin as a potential victim, but we didn't know, so you had to be careful. And then all of a sudden, boom, I see a headline, he's apprehended in Oklahoma. And I said to myself, wow, how did they manage that? So can you take us through how they got to the finish line on him?
Yeah, so things were kind of getting dark. I mean, the family, it was 10 months. They were worried about a lot of things. And like you said, all of a sudden, the family gets a call. I remember it like it was yesterday. And they said, listen, the detectives are saying that we think we're going to get this guy in the next couple hours. And sure enough, news comes out that they grabbed him in a bar in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had completely changed his appearance, and everybody had probably seen the photos of him with the yellow shirt on and handcuffs out front of the bar in Tulsa, and his hair was completely different than what we had seen in that video in March in Los Angeles. And what we've learned, and we don't know a lot, unfortunately, the state's attorney's office for Harford County, as well as the sheriff's office, has been playing pretty close to the vest. But what we do know is through the investigative genealogical, the IGG,
Right.
the drawing the maps of that the family tree is how they were able to ultimately figure out who this guy was. And from what we can tell is they found somebody here in Maryland that through that family tree was somehow related to him.
Right.
And ultimately, when they showed up at the Maryland house, the people said, "Oh yeah, he was here. By the way, there are his clothes right there. He left them here, and you can go ahead and test those." And obviously, they tested them, confirmed it. And then our guess is they probably used technology because they now had a name to then say, okay, when he gets back on whatever device, phone, Facebook, Instagram, we can then connect that IP address and make that connection.
Terrific police work. And a lot of times, this is the kind of stuff that goes on under the radar. Nobody realizes it's going on. I'm going to
Yeah.
name check the Brian Koberger case. The initial lead, the timeline's a little fuzzy, and it was challenged out there. It held up. But the initial lead came from exactly this kind of work. You had some DNA, you punch it through the commercial databases, not even the federal database. And what you end up getting is not necessarily a direct hit. Generally, you don't. What you're going to get is a second cousin or something like that. But then comes the real scut work as a detective. You have to say, okay, this comes back to 16 people potentially. Which one of these is potentially going to lead me to my guy? And in this instance, it looks like they got that information back. They probably looked at it and they said, okay, we have 8 possibles, 4 possibles. Well, these 2 are in Maryland. Let's start there. And after that, it's gumshoe work. It is knocking on doors and interviewing people. It is database work. And ultimately, you get to the point where you can say, hey, we might have somebody. And then you do the other confirmatory stuff like you're talking about, the technical work. The problem is there is that it's very cutting edge. So
Yeah,
if you're
and
law enforcement, it's not entirely established in case law.
right. And you're right about the Koberger case. They're actually arguing this week. They're talking about the defense has filed motions that they're going to challenge that information they got from that little swab on the buckle of the knife sheath and saying, you couldn't use that to ultimately track him back to the house in Pennsylvania. But this is exactly the thing. It's the investigative genetic genealogy that is able to give these departments that sort of second, third, fourth level of family members that they can then go track them down and say, hey, you know somebody that might have been here? Is this person related? And that's how this happened.
It's amazing. And to even complicate it further, and it's a different podcast, but one of the main commercial firms is either going bankrupt or being taken over. And everybody's wondering, if you're in our business, what's going to happen to all that information? Can you grab it and import it into federal databases? Nobody agreed to that, so you can't. Is that all going to go away? It's such a vital investigatory tool. And again, that's something that's going to be have. These are all cutting edge things. Look at TikTok. Nobody knows what the hell to do with that either, right? So we're all, these days, law is always 10 years behind the technology, and this is a good example of it. But you know what? They did good work. They used the tools that they had. Looks like they got their guy, allegedly. We're not saying his name because we don't want to say his name. Now, and you're going to hear his name enough anyway when the trial starts. I want to switch into the prosecution now, which is right in your bailiwick. So they got an accused. He's going to go to trial. It looks like he's fighting it all the way here to the 1 yard line. Is there any indicia at this point? Let's get this out of the way, that there could be a plea deal, or is that something that even the prosecutor's not putting on the table?
No, we've heard rumors, but I got to tell you, the prosecutor's playing it pretty close to the vest as well, which is interesting here. But nonetheless, they've certainly said that that's a possibility that they may place something on the table. The problem is that I would guess, at least from my perspective, is whatever they place on the table is going to be so high, such a high penalty, such a severe penalty, that it may be, it may not be something that entices him to take a plea. And that meaning, typically a plea deal is given so it maybe takes something off the table. Like in Maryland, the maximum penalty is life without parole. You
Right.
may take the life without parole off the table and say, hey, look, you could get parole in, say, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And that gives them an incentive to take a deal. The problem with this is it's so heinous. It's such a bad. You're talking about, Paul, you have a kidnapping, you
Yeah.
have a rape, and you have
Yeah.
a murder of
Yeah.
a beautiful woman in Harford County. They don't put up with that in this county. And so they want to send a message that, look, we're not going to be dealing with this.
And not only that, but from what it sounds like is they have a strong case, right? They
That's
have,
right.
however they arrived at it, they have DNA. And you and I both know the CSI effect these days. You get DNA and you get anything else that's anecdotal here, that's, tangential to that. That's a slam dunk for most juries. And they probably feel like there's no reason for a plea. We got this guy, and let's go all the way with it.
Yeah, that is one theory, and I agree with you on that. And so, just to give you sort of a timeline of the legal process, when he was arrested in Tulsa, he was extradited. He didn't fight extradition. He ultimately came back to Maryland. He had a bail review hearing. It was the first time that the family was able to see him, at least through video, at that bail review hearing. And obviously, his bail was denied, so he's been sitting at a bail review hearing. He's had a couple of hearings since then. The only one in person was a hearing where he went in and they did some preliminary discussions, set some new dates. But at the end of this month, at January 31st, he has a motions hearing date. And that's where the defense has filed what's called a motion for change of venue. The defense is asking for the case to be removed from Harford County and transferred to a different jurisdiction or a different county in the state of Maryland.
So I doubt that's going to happen. This is just Paul's opinion. Every perp files for a change of venue in a high profile case. But on the other hand, Koberger, to reference that case again, got it. On the other hand, it was a bad move because he ended up with a stricter judge who's moving it along, and according to the reporting, is going to be even less likely to give Brian Koberger, anything like a play here. So you never know how these things are going to work out.
Yeah, I mean, Maryland has a history of denying change of venues, and let me just give you a couple of examples with the big cases. Remember Freddie Gray, the riots in Baltimore, the
I
police
do,
officers
sure,
that were charged, right?
absolutely,
Change of venue denied.
yeah.
Marilyn Mosby, famous prosecutor for
Who
the city of,
blew that case, by the way? I'm
right.
just,
And today she's complaining she didn't get a pardon from Biden on his last day. But
huh.
nonetheless, she had her change of venue denied. So I don't think a change of venue will be granted in this case. And certainly all the judges in Maryland at least come down to it and say, listen, you can file a change of venue now. I'll reserve on it. But if I can find 12 people that say that they can be fair and and impartial to this defendant, I'm not granting a change of venue. The only reason for a change of venue is if you can't find people that can be fair in that trial.
And the other thing, of course, is that the case was nationally known. And so, where would you move it to ostensibly where you could say, that there's no implication of prejudice? And we both know at a more ground level, judges don't like to give up big cases.
That's
And
right.
so the judge that caught the case is inclined to say, no, 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 I got my arms around this and I want to roll with it. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're exactly right. And they want to try it in Harford County because, and I think it cuts both ways, is that not only did he commit the crime there, but the family is there. The victims are there. The community who has suffered from this needs to be heard there in that community. So I don't think that motion is going to change. Now, here's one other little twist to this, Paul, that's sort of odd. We're now about 10 days, I believe, from that hearing, and there haven't been that many motions filed in this case, which leads me to believe that the defense may ask for a postponement. I don't know if that's going to happen because they've had plenty of time to prepare for this. He's got appointed public defender. They may come in and say, listen, Judge, our trial schedules and trial calendars have been so busy, we haven't had a chance to really spend time to handle this. Remember, he's also working through an interpreter. He does not speak English because he
Right.
is from El Salvador. So they may come in and say, hey, look, we need more time. Because like the Koberger case, that IgG data, IgG evidence,
Yeah.
those motions were never filed. So it calls into question, are they going to ask for more time here to file more motions before this trial date in April?
April is the current trial date.
April is in Harford County, they set a pretrial date the day before, and then April 1st is the set trial date right now.
I got to tell you, from my perspective, having gone fairly deep in the weeds on this relative to the Koberger case, I don't think they got a shot. And while it's new law, it comes down to issues of standing and things like that. Remember something, you're not actually going at the perpetrator, him or herself. You end up getting to somebody who's tangential to that. Generally, they have signed a release when they sent in their sample. And so that's who would have to object as opposed to the perpetrator. It gets very legalistic and very nested. But frankly, I don't give him a chance in hell. I think he ends up at trial.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on the Koberger case. And it's what expectation of privacy do you have of your DNA on that button of the sheath? And then, like you said, what expectation of privacy do the people have that waived it, that said, hey, listen, I'm willing to give my DNA up and be in this database for situations just like this?
What about LA, real quickly here? Obviously, the Morin case is going to take precedent. It's a serious charge. Is there any indication that LA is waiting in line to get at this guy as well for the crimes out there?
Well, I'll double down on that for you, Paul, real quick. There's not only LA, but El Salvador has a Interpol warrant out for him because
Right.
apparently before he left El Salvador, he did the exact same thing to a woman there. He raped and murdered her, allegedly. California has not really said much. Los Angeles hasn't said much about this case and whether they intend to prosecute him. You have to obviously serve the sentence here first. If he's convicted, theoretically, he would go back to California. And then obviously there was an ICE detainer lodged as soon as he was picked up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So he's not going anywhere anytime soon. At the end of the day, he's ultimately going to go back to El Salvador. And as you know, and I think we've talked about this in the past, that most of the gang members there are going straight into the prisons where they're holding them all. So, that might be the first stop if he goes back to El Salvador.
And that prison is no picnic. The Salvadoran prison is in the middle of nowhere. It's like on this flat desert plain. They actually have the title of the place itself has something to do with the term terrorism is right in the name of the prison, and that dovetails very well with what Donald Trump is currently trying to do, which is to designate the cartels, and those are primarily Mexican, but nonetheless, they see these people as terrorists. There's it's at 500% capacity or something like that. So I'm sure he is desperate not to go back there.
Well, Paul, and I know this is probably a subject matter for another podcast, but talking about the Donald Trump effect, and if you remember, right after they found the suspect in this case, President Trump reached out to Patty Morin with a long phone call, offering his condolences, and really Rachel Morin became one of the main, women that was a focal point between Laken Riley, Rachel Morin, and Jocelyn Nungary were the three women that were all discussed during the campaign, and I really I'm convinced that it was a major factor and a deciding factor for a lot of voters who weren't happy with the immigration policies in the United States.
I think there's no question about that because you know what? It all sounds very notional, but when you start to put a face on it, people pay attention. And one of the points I make online and on the air, and I'm always careful about it, full disclosure, because I don't want it to be taken the wrong way. But I just say, look, I know it's politically incorrect, but let's just call it what it is. They almost always victimize women. And, there's all this stuff these days that anything a man can do, a woman can do, and everything else. Okay, fair enough. Different argument. But the bottom line is when you look at the roster of people that the gangbangers and others, like the accused in this instance, and still only the accused, we recognize that. But that said, when you look at the roster of people who have come to the fore as being victimized, it's almost always women. And, I think it is important, even in the Laken Riley case, you don't know because these guys are unvetted what they did back in their home countries. And this guy is accused of a slew of crimes in his own country. And let me ask you this. If they had a red notice on him, which is what it's called from Interpol, I used to work with Interpol. I've been over to Lyon. You put a red notice on somebody who's an international fugitive when they're convicted in a separate country. And it's very often done in countries that don't have a lot of resources. That's where Interpol is supposed to fill a gap. And so they put what's called a red notice, which is essentially an international warrant. People don't realize Interpol doesn't have a sort of enforcement arm. They don't send agents out. They have it in the movies, but in real life, they don't send agents out to dragoon somebody in the middle of the night. The idea is that with a red notice, it pops at the border. And so when this guy tries to come across any border internationally that's a signatory to Interpol, and most nations are, there's supposed to be a notice that says, hold on a second, grab this guy. He's wanted in El Salvador for a rape and a murder. In this case, from what I count, 4 entries into America. Am I wrong?
Now, you had 3 where he actually was caught between late January 2023 and February of 2023.
And the warrant didn't pop. So when was the Interpol warrant dropped on him? Do we know?
Well, that's El Salvador has been sort of tight-lipped about when that actually was set in, and they haven't really given any details.
You should ask the
about that.
NYPD. For the NYPD has a representative in Lyon, and if that comes through official channels, you may want to whisper in the ear of whoever has the case down in Maryland in the sheriff's office, because they reach out to the PD and say, hey, can you guy tell us? I'm not sure it's pertinent to the case, but I don't understand how he was caught 3 times and there was an Interpol red notice on this guy for a murder and a rape, and they didn't say, grab this guy.
Yeah. Now that goes back to the Fingerprint Act, which they should have been at least collecting the data. Think about this, Paul. Had they been swabbing, which they were supposed to do, this is a $5 kit that takes 30 seconds to administer.
Right.
3 separate times they would have been able to do this with this gentleman, yet they don't do it, okay? Think about this. If they had collected that information, when they got that DNA hit in California, they would have immediately known, hey, this is so-and-so. We know he tried to cross here. Here's a picture of him. Here's all of his tattoos. Here's what he looks like. Maybe even has an ankle monitor on because they might have been monitoring. They didn't do any of that kind of stuff. So instead, they catch him, they do whatever, and they throw him back into Mexico, and he tries again, and he tries again. And then finally, on the 4th time, as you mentioned, he's got away. He's never caught, and he makes it up to California.
And what's the theory? This guy here is coming into the country to start a new life. What do we expect here? That this guy's going to go to medical school? This guy is going to be a career criminal preying upon American women for the rest of his days if he's out. And yet, as you said, a $5 kit and a little bit of common sense, Rachel Morin would be alive. And God knows what else, because you and I both know, Randolph, a guy like this, if he did it twice, which he apparently did in America and then also back in El Salvador, am I wrong in saying that there's likely other victims out there?
Oh, we have no doubt of that. I mean, we were saying from the very beginning that there's got to be other victims out there that we just don't know about. I'm a little surprised now that we have obviously his name, his picture, and now we've obviously got fingerprints as well, which, a lot of times in investigations, you don't always get DNA, but more often than not, you get fingerprints. So my thought was once they catch this guy and they put his fingerprints into the system, ultimately more information will come back. Now, there's also a thought that possibly there's victims that just don't want to come forward because they might be scared, they might be worried about any associations he may have. There's allegations that he is involved with some sort of gang.
13, right?
Yeah, right. So, and there might be victims within a community, and as I think you point on this early on in California and Los Angeles, that there are certain communities that don't want to speak up because of the fear. The Hispanic community may be scared about the consequences from other gang members because they spoke up against another one. So there is that worry that there are other victims out there. And we were saying that from the very beginning. But remember, we didn't know that he was from El Salvador until they caught him. But right around a month or 2 before they actually caught him, we did start running campaigns along the southern border, along the Texas and California border. We were running social media campaigns with Instagram and Facebook. We were running them on different Spanish-speaking news channels like Telemundo and things of that nature, because we thought, you know what, we know he's a Hispanic male. This is becoming too far removed from catching him that we've got to be able to point maybe back to him coming across the border.
And that was really, really clever work. And, even though it didn't end up maybe being dispositive in the case, you don't know, because anything could be developing that we don't know. As you said, not only the sheriff's office, but the prosecutor playing things very close to the chest. And I'm sure there's good reasons for this. They'll talk up a lot more, I'm sure, once the jury comes back. Hopefully, again, innocent until proven guilty. But hopefully when they bring back a guilty verdict on this guy, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more. Has there been any sort of talk about the fact that, wow, we wish we had the death penalty on the table, if for no other reason than it gives you a card to play relative to a plea.
Maryland is, unfortunately, Paul, keeps going farther and farther to the left, and the death
Right.
penalty is something that's been off the table for a very, very long time here. Now, that being said, Harford County is probably one of the more conservative counties in the state of Maryland. So I'm certain that the local residents there would certainly love to have the death penalty as a bargaining chip. But in the state of Maryland, the death penalty has been off the table for, gosh, I think it's been since maybe
I
15
think
or 18.
2013, it looks like.
2013. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
So it's something that really has not been in the toolkit of a lot of prosecutors. And unfortunately, the worst they can give him is life without parole. So we're going to end up having to pay for this guy to sit in the Maryland detention center for the next, he's 24, I think now, 25, let's say the next 50, 60 years.
yeah. And we're going to be responsible for his care and feeding, and they're going to have to pay for it. And it also gives impetus to move the case because, as you said, Harford County is more right leaning. His defense attorney is almost certainly pushing for that change of venue to get to a more blue jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure though if you moved it. And really, the three big blue jurisdictions in the state of Maryland are Baltimore City, Montgomery, or PG County in southern Maryland, down by D.C., and then a little bit more Baltimore County, which surrounds Baltimore City. But even if you move it into those more left-leaning liberal cities and jurisdictions, I really don't see a jury coming back and saying, you know what, all this DNA, and I am convinced there is more to the evidence that the state has and the defense now has through discovery, to the process of giving that to the defense, than we know about. And I think they've got a much stronger case. I bet they could track him a lot more with the digital forensics and maybe some other sightings and videos that they maybe now that they know who he is, they can go back and say, okay, yeah, now we see there he is right there.
So we're going towards a trial. Just to clarify, you are the lawyer for the Morin family. You're doing all of this pro bono. You're not getting a dime out of it. In fact, I suspect with all the stuff that you guys did, you're in the hole for some money. So are you going to have a presence at the trial? Will you be at the trial once it starts? And will you be talking to the media and to me?
Well, Paul, I'm always going to be talking to you because you're the best. But unfortunately, what's happened in Maryland, and more so is with this judge, Maryland is one of those states that does not allow cameras in the courtroom, which I do not agree with 100%. It's just a
Right.
horrible, horrible policy. Not only that, the judge in this case has banned any type of electronic devices. So when we went to the last hearing and I took a computer in as a lawyer to try to take notes, they said, nope, you can't do that. You're going to have to go old fashioned with your yellow pad and take your notes on that. So
Oh,
no
well.
computers in the courtroom, no Twitter, no tweeting. You've got to write everything down. And so I will be in the courtroom every day with the family, taking notes and ultimately providing it to anybody that wants it.
You're going to end up with carpal tunnel.
I
So
know. My
last
shorthand
question.
back.
Last question I want to get to, and I'm going to lead us in a little bit of a speculative direction. We mentioned 13 quite quickly. Just to clarify, that's MS-13, a notorious Salvadoran gang, as bloodthirsty as any of the ones out there, and if anything, bigger than Tren de Aragua, which we hear so much about. They're a little bit more established. Donald Trump crushed them here in the New York area. They were very established on Long Island. As soon as Trump left office, they came back because the cases had to be federal. Is there indicia that this perp is in fact MS-13 affiliated?
They haven't said which one he's affiliated with, so they haven't confirmed which one he is, but they have said he has gang relations. And I'll tell you this, Paul, I was a prosecutor in Baltimore County from '06 to '09, and I was the head of the gang unit for the district court at that time, and we had MS-13 back then in the county. So they have been around a long time here. They certainly aren't as prevalent as they used to be, but the Trinidad de Agua, we've talked about this during the Lake and
Yeah.
Riley special. I mean, they are a different breed. Dismembering individuals, the scare tactics. I mean, they do not hold back when they want to commit a crime.
Yeah, they're really making their presence known, and up here in New York, they're actually starting to butt heads with some of the established gangs. Here's why I ask, and this is the point that's really speculative. Donald Trump, newly inaugurated yesterday, is saying he is going to designate the cartels and the various gangs as terrorist organizations. Now, I find that to be maybe a tough row to hoe because terrorism is defined as doing what you do, criminal acts, for an ideological purpose. And these gangs, generally, they operate on a profit motive.
Right.
But if he gets that over the finish line, here's where I'm going with this, and I'm going to give you the last word. If he manages to get that, and let's say he gets 13 designated, and you have this guy doing what he's doing for as a member of MS-13, Donald Trump manages all those legal hoops. You have a federal case against the accused here. That puts the death penalty back on the table. So speculation, but I'm going to give you the last word, not only on that, but on the case in general. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I think it's going to be a tough hurdle. As you said, it has to be ideological, that they have to be able to convince that they are a terrorist based on that. I think it's smart. I mean, think about this. He now, if he gets the terrorist sort of connotation, the label put on these individuals, it helps him, one, to start going after these suspects on the federal level, but it also helps him deal with the issues of the drug cartels bringing the money and bringing the people and bringing possibly type of other substances or items across that border. And look, this is a topic for another podcast, is that then how do you sort of thread the needle of, do we start going across the border and do we start attacking the cartels there? I see what you're saying, though, is how do we bring them into the federal system? There certainly could be a way to prosecute these people on the federal system, and I've seen this recently, and I'm drawing a blank on the case I just covered the other day about this, but finding some sort of federal law that they violated, maybe by crossing a border and ultimately committing a crime and then getting them with the federal system there. That's one way of doing it. But remember, the feds have so much to do that it's hard to do that in every single case. But I think it's smart on the Trump administration to do this. It certainly gives them one more tool in the toolkit to try to go after bad cases like this and sort of follow through on the campaign promises of, hey, we're going to stop the fentanyl, we're going to stop the trafficking, and we're going to stop these people coming across and committing murders and killing people like Rachel Morin and Laken Riley and Jocelyn Nungry.
I agree. And what a case that would be, right? I mean, and again, no shade to the prosecutors down in Maryland or the sheriff's office. I'm sure they are doing everything they can to button this case up, and it sounds like they've done a good job. But boy, if you could get this into the federal system, what a feather in the cap for Donald Trump, who would make this part of his campaign promise remit. But then also, as I said, it'll move faster. That penalty will be on the table. Doubt that's going to happen here. We're going towards a trial. Looks like it's April. But these are the kinds of issues that are around this case and other cases like it. And I think you and I are going to be talking about that kind of thing again going forward. Randolph, we appreciate you being here. Your expertise, as ever, very clearly. You have a lot of insight on this case. As we go forward, we want to have you back to talk about this because obviously we care about this case. It's so important. And hats off to you and Rice Law. People can find you online at Rice Law. Am I right?
Yeah, ricelawmd.com, and you go anywhere at Rice Law MD and pretty much find us on all the social networks and everywhere else. You can kind of keep up with all of the different appearances. And we're talking about the Rachel Morin case, obviously, every chance we can.
Outstanding. So, look, we appreciate all your work and your being here today. Godspeed to you. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We'll catch you next time here on the Ops Desk Podcast.